how do you establish credibility early with folks and then paint that path for them, that it can be a incredibly sort of liberating career and can also be very lucrative from a financial perspective.
So how's your life impacted the strategies you're taking as a CRO, and what would you say your main philosophies are in the role?
So has my personal life sort of impacted how I approach the
Yeah, personal and professional. You can pull in anything you choose to.
Yeah, I think I actually started my career on the research side of things. So coming out of university in the UK, I was working for a services business called CB, Corporate Executive Board. And my first role was basically creating research consulting reports for FTSE 100 companies in the UK and then some of the large companies across Europe. And while sort of an intellectually interesting job and challenging, I quickly realized the elements of sort of the professional role that I enjoyed the most was communicating directly with customers or prospective customers. That sort of human interaction, the opportunity to shape, influence people's perspectives in the moment, and guide them in some way, shape or form. And as I looked at the various roles that were available to me at the time, I very much gravitated to the sales side of things, because I think it enables you to sort of leverage your sort of intellectual capabilities and influencing skills in the moment. With an opportunity to sort of, it's almost sort of intellectual judo, where you're in a sales conversation, maybe 60 seconds, you're trying to gain interest and earn the right to have a conversation, or you're spending more time to sell a value proposition and convince someone to make the investment. You're almost on stage for a short period of time, and you have one shot. And I very much enjoy the sort of the thrill of the chase in that regard, and the sort of professional and intellectual challenge that presents. And I think for me personally, sort of it links back to, as a younger individual, very much orientated by sports. I know it's a bit of a stereotype that's used frequently in association with sales, but there are many, many parallels to each and every sport that exists. And I spent most of my youth in and around various sports, and a lot of the skills that I'd learned through that time parlayed very well into the sales world, and that certainly stayed true throughout my career. Now, when you talk about the CRO role, one of the things that I loved in and around sports was playing with teams and leading teams, and had lots of experience with that earlier in my career. So the opportunity to, firstly, obviously be successful as an individual contributor, but then step up into a leadership role and shape and influence people's careers and professional paths was honestly probably for me the most rewarding thing. And that remains the same today. I love the profession of sales. I love what we do. But the most enjoyable piece for me is bringing in individuals early in their career, potentially into BDR, SDR roles, and giving them a platform to grow, be successful, graduate into frontline sales positions, and then develop great careers. And when I started off in sales back in the 90s, sales was a bit of a dirty word. The profession wasn't respected. And I think today that's a very different case. I view it as sort of a profession similar to law, accounting, in terms of the impact and credibility it has within the business universe. And every day of the week, I take a C+ product with an A+ sales team, as opposed to the reverse, because great sales teams grow great businesses. So to your point earlier, in terms of the opportunity in a CRO role or a sales leadership role to shape, have impact in a business is, I think, truly unique. And I've thoroughly enjoyed that platform.
Yeah, okay. Was judo one of those sports you enjoyed?
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, it was football.
It was soccer, yeah. Football, yeah. Stroke soccer, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. No, this is actually really topical. I've been doing some reading recently, and the theme that we often hear is that people fall into sales and they don't plan that career path.
Yeah.
which is really interesting. I mean, in your experience, what can we do to make this more of a planned career path? And what's the consequences of people falling into this profession without it being a planned career path, especially for sales leaders and how they have to coach people?
Yeah, I certainly, I mean, I somewhat fell into it by mistake, I would say. I certainly didn't join the first company that I joined with the expectation of going into sales. And at that time, many of my peers had done the same. They'd come from legal backgrounds, they'd come from consulting backgrounds, but gravitated to sales. I think it goes back to sort of the early stages, probably when people are at school, 16, 17, trying to figure out their path at university, next steps, and how do we as sales professionals give people the opportunity to sort of get exposed to sales as a profession and as a career, provide internships for people to learn about the role, and get academy training sort of early in their professional careers. So in the businesses that I've worked in across the last 20 years, we've had a keen interest in internship programs, specifically focused on sales to help educate individuals. We've developed relationships with university programs to try and sort of espouse the benefits of a sales career. So I think investing in individuals who are sort of transitioning out of high school, secondary school, into university, thinking about curriculums within universities that promote sales as a career, and those definitely exist in the US today. I did a sort of mini MBA at Cambridge. So my final year, I did management science, but sales was not a part of the curriculum at the time. It was very much focused on sort of economics, other business topics. Again, sales, I think at that time was viewed as a sort of a dirty word, dirty profession. So how do you establish credibility early with folks and then paint that path for them, that it can be a incredibly sort of liberating career, and can also be very lucrative from a financial perspective. So sure, as you know, as many of the people you've interviewed know, if you're successful in sales, you can make a lot of money.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're right, actually, because going off topic here, but when I got into sales, it was by a call from a recruiter. But I spent my first 6 months desperately trying to not be a salesperson, and actually that made me really ineffective. You know, I'm really interested to hear more about how you train your reps and introduce them into the environment where they do feel the pride and where they do combat some of the societal perceptions we have of the trade.
Yeah, I think if I think back to some of the roles I've had and the roles I've been in more recently, for entry level folks, people coming in from university, or maybe they have 1 to 2 years of experience, they typically start in that SDR, BDR role, which is I think it's one of the toughest positions in any company, because you're building the brand sort of ground up. You're the tip of the spear. Again, trying to earn the right to have a conversation. And it's a great training ground for many of the sales fundamentals that people need to develop. And so I think the job in itself provides individuals the opportunity to test out whether they like sales and whether they can succeed, because 9 times out of 10, if not more, you hear the word no. And so it just tests those fundamental traits that dictate success. But then at the same time, we invest in the future. So we set up ongoing training programs. Basically, I talked about the word academy. We create sales academies. So 80% of the time, folks are in their day-to-day job, but 20% of the time, they're in the classroom. We're giving them the opportunity to develop and flex those skills that are going to set them up for success for a transition into a frontline sales role. Because just being a great BDR and SDR doesn't necessarily translate to being a successful sales executive. So across the first sort of 18 to 24 months of their career, we're trying to train some of those sort of fundamental customer-facing skills that will enable them to make that transition successfully. And sort of goes back to one of your other questions as well, in terms of sort of how do we make sales more credible as a profession? I think there's an opportunity to create, and I haven't seen anyone done this well yet, create a credentialing system in the business world for sales. You've got sort of the MBA that many people gravitate to in the sort of first 4 to 5 years of their professional experience as a stamp of approval. Is there a sales orientated version of that, or a different professional accreditation that we could create that is sales specific and is sort of the stamp of approval that you are on the path from a sort of sales professional standpoint?
Okay. Yeah. Sales academies giving the key skills, but also giving the testing and proving grounds for people to make it into a profession. Okay. This is great, Richard. So we're talking here about the soft skills, training people to be great salespeople, but let's look at the data now, the theme of the discussion.
Yeah.
How do you use data in your sales teams? What do you use it for? What do you look for?
Yeah, I regard myself as quite a data-driven individual. Again, not to be cliche, I mean, sales is a science and an art, but it's much more of a science today. And so one of the first things I do when coming into any new role is looking at the data available, the instruments to fly the plane, if you will, because data determines strategy and how you prioritize your resources. So I'll maybe talk you through the journey that I've been on at Higher Logic recently, because I think it's emblematic of sort of the data that we use to try and drive decisions. So one of the first things I look at is what's the TAM, the total addressable market, and have we defined our TAM? Which verticals are we operating into? What are the subsegments that exist? And then as you look across that addressable market, how does the customer profile vary? So one of the first things I look to do is set up a prospect scoring system, an account scoring system, simple ABC methodology that looks at a set of criteria that indicates propensity to buy. So A accounts have a higher propensity to buy than B's and C's. And that provides a foundation for me to set up my sales territories, to align my sales resources accordingly, to ensure that my sales teams are prioritizing the highest value segments within their territories, and that those territories are assigned appropriately in terms of sort of size. So when setting territories, we're looking at penetration rate. What's the typical penetration rate across a year? How many sales meetings, how many sales opportunities am I going to generate? What's the assumed win rate? What's the assumed ASP? And what's the assumed sales cycle? And so I'm using that data to basically create a foundation that enables me to know how many sales teams, how many sales individuals do I need on the field, and how am I going to set their quotas accordingly to drive sort of the growth objectives for the business. So those are sort of the core fundamentals, if you will, that sit at the foundation of at least the sales organizations that I run. And then we are continually monitoring those indicators on a week by week, month by month basis to identify trends. So where are we seeing sort of challenges in market engagement? Where might we need to reposition ourselves? Where do we need to deploy more marketing resources to generate leads? Where is the business succeeding? Where can we move faster? Where are the points of least resistance? And so I'm continually looking at those dashboards with my sales leaders to make sure that we're flying the plane effectively, and we're focused on the highest value opportunities for the business, and we're applying resources accordingly. So those are some of the fundamentals, if you will, of the business. The other thing that we do from a competitive standpoint is pay a lot of attention to win-loss data. Yeah. So understanding where we're winning, why we're winning, and probably more importantly, where we're losing and why we're losing, and making sure that we move beyond anecdote to fact and trend. So one of the things I've experienced across the course of my career, and this is no criticism of sales executives individually, it's just human nature. You tend to gravitate to the most recent sales conversations you've had to inform the feedback that you're providing to partners across the business. That doesn't necessarily reflect what's going on across the market, because sales individuals are seeing sort of one piece of the equation, if you will, through the territories or the markets that they're engaged with. And so we're trying to build sort of fact-based win-loss analysis that enable us to aggregate true trends in the market so that we can sit down with product partners, we can sit down with marketing partners to basically provide fact-based insights that again then influence the investments and resources that we're deploying across the business.
Yeah, superb. Okay. So you're producing strategies based on these facts, based on this data. Talk to me, I mean, at some stage, strategy becomes tactics on the ground. So talk to me about how you handle that key handover and you filter through this information down to the individual rep or sales leader so they can use it, so it impacts them.
Yeah, that's great. I think one of the mistakes I've certainly made in the past is not paying enough attention to how I empower and educate my sales leaders to drive that change. Because ultimately, as you scale an organization, I can't be speaking to each and every frontline executive on a daily basis. So your success is heavily dictated by your sales leaders. Their ability to understand the strategy, the why, and then the how, so that I can empower them to lead and manage that change on a sort of continuous basis. And we've gone through a tremendous amount of transformation at Higher Logic as we've acquired 4 businesses, as we completely upended our go-to-market model. And there are definitely mistakes along the way I've made, I think, in not sort of bringing the managers on the journey sufficiently, or assuming that they are on the journey with me and they know everything and they don't. So I've learned to really sort of overinvest in the leadership component and empowering them to be successful. Then as it relates to the front line, for me, it's sort of managing that change process very carefully and trying to be as simplistic as possible in terms of sort of whether it be behavioral change that you're trying to enact, whether you'd be trying to get people to sell differently or represent your product differently. That can be very hard for an individual, a frontline exec that may have been selling the same thing for the last 5 years, and suddenly you're asking them to do something very different. And so how do you keep it simple? Again, I think I try to be as transparent in my communications as possible. And I think, honestly, 50 to 70% of this is all around communication and effective communication and being transparent as to how did we get to this conclusion around strategy? How is that leading to new tactical actions? How does that impact you? What are we asking from you? How are we going to measure it? And then how do we ensure that it empowers you to be more successful? Because obviously any change, any sort of new strategy or tactic you're trying to employ is, in an ideal world, hopefully driving sales productivity. That means that rep has got a better chance of attaining their quota, has got a better chance of overachieving against plan, and obviously earning commissions. So there's an element of the sort of what's in it for me, and you've got to take people along that journey sort of hand in hand.
Yeah, okay, superb. You know, this is great because the interesting thing about data is it can seem really clear. It can seem like it's telling an obvious story, but in reality, interpretations of data can be really different. So how have you learned to check in with your sales leaders, like you said, to see that they are on that journey with you, that they read from the same hymn sheet as you are reading from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's firstly, it's having a clear set of KPIs. So you've got consistency. So again, and again, I've made this mistake several times in terms of trying to drive change management. Yeah. You come out with a new framework, with a new set of metrics, you focus on them religiously for the first 4 to 8 weeks, and then it dies a death, and you lose momentum. So part of it is just relentless sort of rigor around, again, picking a small set of KPIs, because I've made the mistake of picking 10 different indicators, trying to measure them. People get confused from the get-go, and it's impossible to manage. I now live and manage in the world of threes. What are the 3 most important metrics relative to a project that we're going to measure and track to determine whether we're sort of realizing success or we need to make course corrections? Because no plan is going to be perfect, and data isn't perfect. And so you've got to be agile and flexible and willing to say, this was wrong, we need to adjust X or Y to drive the ultimate outcome. So with the sales leaders, I meet with my sales leaders each and every week for 30 minutes to review a defined set of KPIs, to check in, track progress. We meet as a sales leadership team every 2 weeks to review sort of the broader strategy for the sales organization and the business and our sort of performance against those, to track sort of, are we driving the outcomes and success that we're looking for? And then I think the other thing for me in terms of checking in, how do you know if it's resonating in the field? Part of that is skip level conversations. So each and every quarter, I'm doing a set of skip level conversations quite purposefully with individuals at the front line. These are open-ended conversations, but I'm listening to sort of what they're doing, how they're trying to drive success, the relationship with the manager, how the manager is directing them. And that enables me to understand sort of, are these change initiatives having impact? Are they playing out? You see it, you see that in the metrics, but you can't substitute for a qualitative conversation. And then the other thing, honestly, is ride-alongs. Are you getting on calls with customers? And are you hearing how people are presenting and positioning the platform in the market? You can't substitute for sort of those experiences. The other sort of interesting thing we do now, we've invested in the tool Gong, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And we are, I think, using that very successfully to collect intelligence from all of our sales calls. So we've been implementing new sales training methodologies, Challenger across the last year. We're gravitating to sort of the medic sales methodology this year. And there are sort of keywords, phrases that we expect reps to be using in frontline conversations. We can now test for that through that tool to determine, are the reps representing the platform, the solution as we would expect, as we'd like? Are we hearing about the competitors in those calls that we expect to be hearing about? And so there's vast intelligence that you can then aggregate back to sort of pulling in data to look at themes that help us to understand what's going on in the field at scale.
Incredible. Okay, Richard, closing question for you. If you were in a room full of superstar CROs, like the very best, what would you like to ask them?
Great question. I think sort of the traits that denote sort of longevity and success in role, because as you alluded to at the start, the average tenure for a sales leader is about 18 months.
Yeah. And
so I think many of us who are in this profession are in it for the long term. And you join a company to get on a path, hopefully for 4, 5, 6 years, to drive it through a set of major milestones, whether that be transaction, whether that be getting to a certain revenue number, a maturity level, if you will. And so as professionals, how do we look around corners? Because we're all going to make strategic missteps. We're going to make mistakes. Some of those may ultimately be career limiting. But how do you look around corners so that you create a professional path for yourself for the long term, not just for a short period of time? Understanding how people think about that, how they manage their own careers accordingly, I think is fascinating.